All right, so welcome to another deep dive on pencil, paper, plot.
Yeah, it's great to be back.
And today we're going to look at something a little bit different than what we normally do, but it's still right up our alley.
It's actually a deep dive into a deep dive, if you will.
Oh, yeah.
We are looking at audience reactions and their deep dives into the 2025 live-action remake of Snow White.
Yes, and for anyone who's new to our channel, we take a look at scripts and break down scenes and give advice to aspiring screenwriters and filmmakers and just people who love stories.
Absolutely. And a lot of what we talk about on the channel, things like character arcs and plot twists and payoffs, all of those things we're going to see play out in the analysis we're going to do today.
Yeah, we went through over 1,100 IMDb reviews for the 2025 Snow White remake, and we've kind of categorized and distilled all of those comments. We can break them down for you guys today.
Yeah, and I think just as a starting point, it's worth acknowledging that this film has received a pretty huge round of criticism.
Yeah, a lot of negative reviews.
A lot of negative reviews, but that actually is a perfect opportunity for us as storytellers to really kind of dissect what went wrong and what we can learn from those choices.
Exactly. So let's get into it. One of the most consistent criticisms that we saw coming up again and again in these reviews was about Snow White herself.
And really the lack of a compelling character arc.
Yeah, a lot of reviewers were saying that she was presented as this kind of like strong, independent woman.
Right, and one person even put it as like she was giving like medieval TED Talks.
Yeah, and that's so funny because it's true. It's like there was that feeling that she was more of a mouthpiece for like a modern message than like a genuine character that you could connect with.
And I think a lot of that stems from that one line that so many reviewers brought up where she says, "I want to be a queen, not a bride."
Right. It was like her driving motivation.
And on the surface, that might sound very empowering and modern, but I think what a lot of reviewers were picking up on is that it lacked nuance. It was just like a statement rather than a true expression of her inner conflict and desires.
Yeah. And, as screenwriters, we always talk about, showing, not telling. And I think that's a perfect example of where it felt like they were telling us what she wanted, but we weren't really seeing it play out in her actions and her relationships.
Right, and it's interesting because a lot of the reviewers were comparing this portrayal to the original animated Snow White, and they felt like she was missing that kind of inherent innocence that really grounded the original character.
Right. And so it raises the question of like, how do you update a classic character from a modern audience without losing the essence of what made them work in the first place?
It's a tough balance.
It is. And so speaking of balancing, you've got your protagonist and then you've got your antagonist. And that brings us to the evil queen, who was played by Gal Gadot.
And here the reactions were a little bit more mixed.
Yeah, but I would say still leaning more towards the negative.
For sure. I mean, we did see some positive comments. There were people who said that, her performance was good. And, one person really loved her costumes. They thought they were outstanding. But a lot of people felt like she just didn't have that, like, true menace that you want from a villain.
Yeah, and I think one comment that really captured that feeling was someone who said she was like a fashion blogger with a bad attitude.
Oh, my gosh. Yeah, that's so perfect.
Which, when you think about it, like Gal Gadot is a beautiful woman.
Mhm.
So for some viewers, it was hard to buy into the queen's insecurity about being the fairest of them all.
Right. It's like if you're going to cast someone who is already considered to be like the epitome of beauty, then you have to really work hard to make that insecurity believable.
Exactly. And another common criticism was that she lacked that kind of like emotion and creep charm.
Yeah. Like when you think about classic Disney villains, they often have this like really captivating, almost unsettling presence.
Like you're drawn to them, but also kind of afraid of them at the same time.
Yeah. Right. And it seems like that element was missing for a lot of viewers with this portrayal.
And speaking of elements that were missing, or perhaps elements that were added that shouldn't have been, let's talk about the supporting characters, specifically the dwarfs.
Ah, yeah, this is a big one.
This is a big point of contention for a lot of reviewers because in the original film, the dwarfs are so iconic.
And so memorable.
Yeah, they have such distinct personalities and they play such a key role in the story.
And in this version, they were either transformed into these like CGI magical creatures or just presented as like a diverse group. And neither approach really seemed to land with the audience.
Yeah, the words that kept coming up over and over again were like unsettling, awkward,
Yeah.
unnatural, even creepy.
Yeah, and there was some really vivid comparisons, like someone that they looked like carnival performers stuck in a blender with bad CGI.
It's like you could just feel the discomfort from these reviewers.
Totally. And it wasn't just the visuals either. A lot of people felt like these characters served no real purpose in the story. They were just kind of there for like visual novelty or to deliver like unfunny one-liners.
Yeah, and that's such a crucial lesson for anyone who's writing an ensemble story. Like, every character, even the supporting ones, needs to have a reason for being there. They need to contribute to the plot or to the development of the main characters. Otherwise, they can actually end up detracting from the story.
Right. It's like you're adding extra weight without any real benefit.
Yeah, and we also saw a few mentions of like Jonathan's Seven Bandits.
Oh, yeah, that was interesting.
It seemed like they were trying to create like a mirrored version of the dwarfs, but it didn't really work.
And they had these kind of like random name like Bingley and Norwich.
It just felt like a really forced attempt to echo the original structure.
And it highlights the challenge of adaptation.
Hmm.
You can't just swap out elements from the original without considering how those changes affect the overall narrative.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So moving on from the characters, let's talk about the plot itself.
And how it all kind of came together or didn't come together for a lot of viewers.
Yeah, the overall consensus seemed to be that the plot felt really lifeless and convoluted and nonsensical.
And a lot of people are saying that it just lacked emotional connection.
Yeah, and I think one of the most striking examples of that was how they handled the poisoned apple scene.
Oh, yeah, such a pivotal moment in the story.
Yeah, and instead of being suspenseful and impactful, reviewers were saying it was like long and drawn out.
And there was this like unnecessary speech and weird slow motion
It
effects.
was like they were trying too hard to make it dramatic, and it just ended up feeling really flat.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that sometimes less is more. Sometimes a well-placed beat of silence can be way more powerful than all these like extra bells and whistles.
Exactly. And speaking of things that can distract from the story, let's talk about the visuals and the CGI.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is another area where the reviews were overwhelmingly negative.
I mean, the CGI was just relentlessly criticized.
People were saying it was awkward, artificial, cheap, subpar, like everything under the sun.
Yeah, like distractingly bad, bloated, unsocial.
It's like they threw every negative adjective they could think of at it.
And, when you're watching a big budget fantasy, you expect the visuals to be a major draw. And in this case, it sounds like they were actually a major detraction.
Totally. And, people were specifically talking about how the Enchanted Forest looked like an overprocessed video game backdrop.
It's like that feeling of like you're watching a cutscene rather than being transported to this magical world.
Right. And for a fairy tale, that sense of wonder and immersion is so crucial. And when the visuals don't support, that it really takes you out of the experience.
It's like constantly reminding you that what you're watching isn't real.
And to be fair, we did see one review that praised the CGI on the animal.
Yeah, they said it was the best Disney has done in a long time.
So there's always going to be some differing opinions.
Of course, but the overwhelming response was negative.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about the characters, we've talked about the plot, we've talked about the visuals. What about the music?
Ah, the music. The heart and soul of any Disney film, right?
Well, in this case, the response was a bit mixed.
Yeah, Rachel Zegler's singing voice was consistently praised.
People loved her voice.
Yeah, they said it was strong and a highlight of the film.
But the new songs themselves didn't really seem to land with a lot of viewers.
No, people were saying they were bland and unmemorable and generic.
They just didn't have that, like, timeless quality that you associate with classic Disney songs.
And it's interesting because the songwriters for this film, Pasek and Paul, they've had some huge successes.
Yeah, they're very talented.
Yeah, so it's not like they're incapable of writing good songs, but it seems like in this case they just couldn't quite capture the magic.
Right, and one reviewer said that the Evil Queen song was too whimsical, which is interesting because you don't often hear that criticism.
Yeah, usually it's the opposite.
Right, like people want more whimsy from Disney songs, but in this case it felt like it was maybe tonally inconsistent with the rest of the film.
Yeah, and another person pointed out that one of the new songs sounded a lot like Let It Go and Waiting on a Miracle.
Which is never a good sign.
No, it makes you wonder if they were maybe relying a little too heavily on like familiar formulas rather than trying to create something truly original.
Right, and it's tough because when you're writing music for a remake, you're always going to be compared to the original.
Yeah, and so it's this balancing act of trying to honor what came before while also bringing something new to the table.
It's a challenge.
So we've been going through all these reviews and talking about the different elements of the film. But as the host, we always like to tie things back to the craft of screenwriting.
Exactly. And even though these user reviews aren't explicitly using like screenwriting terminology, we can still see how they're reflecting these fundamental principles.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So, for example, all those criticisms about the pacing that's directly related to the concept of beats in screenwriting.
Right. The beats are those individual moments that move the plot forward and reveal character and build tension. And when those beats aren't working, the whole rhythm of the story feels off.
And the complaints about Snow White's and the evil queen's motivations, that's all about character development.
Yeah, like, were their desires clear? Were their actions believable? Did we as an audience understand why they were doing what they were doing?
And it seems like in this case, a lot of people felt like that foundational character work was missing.
And then you have the disappointment with the poisoned apple scene, which really highlights the importance of payoff in screenwriting.
Right, like you spend the whole movie building up to this moment, and then if it falls flat, it can really leave the audience feeling unsatisfied.
It's like you've broken a promise.
Exactly, and another major theme that we saw running through a lot of these reviews was this sense that the filmmakers were prioritizing like modernization and certain themes over the core essence of the original story.
Yeah, there was this feeling that they were trying to force in like corporate approved modernization and political correctness and forced inclusivity, and it ended up feeling really inauthentic.
Yeah, one reviewer even said that the political moral connotations in this new movie are rather more backwarded than they actually are thinking.
Which is interesting because it suggests that even their attempts at updating the story were kind of misguided.
Yeah, it's like they were trying to check off boxes rather than really engaging with the material in a meaningful way.
And I think what's especially interesting from a storytelling perspective is how the changes to the characters' motivations really shifted the overall themes of the film.
Yeah, like in the original, the focus is on love and kindness and overcoming adversity through inner strength.
And in this version, it felt like the focus was more on like power and ambition and overthrowing the government.
Which are very different themes.
Totally. And it seems like that shift didn't resonate with a lot of viewers.
So for all of you aspiring screenwriters and filmmakers out there, what are some key takeaways from this deep dive into the Snow White reviews?
Well, I think first and foremost, if you're going to reimagine a classic story, you really need to understand what made the original work and make sure that your changes are actually enhancing the story rather than detracting from it.
Yeah, don't just change things for the sake of changing them.
Exactly. And second, we can't stress this enough, character development is key. Give your characters clear motivations, relatable emotions, even your villains, and make sure that their actions feel believable.
And remember, visuals should always serve the story.
Yeah, the CGI, the special effects, all of that should be used to enhance the narrative, not to distract from it.
And pacing is crucial. Keep your story moving at a good pace. Make sure every scene has a purpose.
And if you're using music, make sure it's memorable and emotionally resonant and that it fits organically within the world of the story.
And above all, strive to create an emotional connection with your audience. If people are bored or confused, or they just don't care about your characters, your story's going to struggle.
Right, and don't be afraid to get feedback. Listen to what people are saying about your work, even if it's not all positive.
Yeah, because even negative reviews can be valuable if you approach them with an open mind.
And finally, don't get so caught up in trying to modernize the story that you lose sight of what made it special in the first place.
Yeah, sometimes the best way to update a classic is to just focus on telling a good story.
Exactly. So I think the overall takeaway from this deep dive is that even with a huge budget and a lot of talented people involved, if you don't have those fundamental storytelling principles in place, your film is probably going to struggle.
And so as much as we might love to make fun of bad movies, there's always something to be learned from them.
Always.
So with that in mind, we're going to leave you with a final thought.
What do you think?
Well, given the overwhelmingly negative reaction to this Snow White remake, what do you think it says about the current state of adapting classic stories?
Yeah. And what is the responsibility of creators to both the source material and to their audience?
It's a question worth pondering as you go out and create your own. So thanks for joining us for this deep dive. And as always, if you want more in-depth script analysis and discussions on the craft of screenwriting, be sure to check out Pencil, Paper, Plot right here on YouTube.
And until next time, keep writing.